Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today we're on estate planning of the rich and famous topic, and for today's 71st episode, we're going to be diving into what happened estate-wise following the passing of one of the greatest musicians that has ever walked this planet, the godfather of soul himself, James Brown. As I mentioned at the end of my last episode, what transpired estate-wise following James's passing does not make him the godfather of estate planning. What is crazy is that he did do documents, which is more than a lot of celebrities can say at least. But what did happen estate-wise was a lot. Just a lot of drama and craziness. But before we dive into said drama and craziness, we should talk a little bit about James as a person. I think that always helps not only to give some background of the person, but also just to get familiar with who is near and dear to James, you know? So for starters, according to biography.com's website, James was born on May 3rd, 1933, and he sure had quite a humble beginning. As the website shares, quote, "Growing up in abject poverty during the Great Depression, a young James Brown worked whatever odd jobs he could find for literal pennies. He danced for the soldiers at nearby Fort Gordon, picked cotton, washed cars, and shined shoes." End quote. According to biography.com, after getting in some trouble, he spent some time in jail and ended up meeting a gentleman by the name of Bobby Byrd, who was an aspiring R&B singer. After they were both released, Bobby Byrd found James and invited James to join his R&B vocal group called the Gospel Starlighters in 1955. The Gospel Starlighters ended up renaming their group to be the Famous Flames, and they started to perform at several nightclubs in Georgia. The group ended up connecting with the Talent Scout, and before they knew it, they had a song called Please, Please, Please that hit the number 6 spot on the R&B charts. And soon after, the Famous Flames took to the road and became opening acts for people like B.B. King and Ray Charles. But after some time on the road, the group started to slow down and ended up fizzling out a bit. Still according to biography.com, James then moved to New York in 1958. He started working with some different musicians and artists, but still under the name Flames. Together, they put together and recorded a song called Try Me, which skyrocketed to number 1 in the R&B charts. It is said to have kickstarted James's individual music career. Thereafter, he just boomed. So big that he was well known in the music space to be so very hardworking, and often having tour stops 5 or 6 nights every week. Through the 50s and 60s, James was a powerhouse to say the least, but things really started to slow down in the late 70s. However, he made a comeback in the 80s, that is until the late 1980s. He did get back into music for a bit after that. And even according to his Wikipedia page, he actually performed at the 1997 Super Bowl halftime show, and he would have been 62 at that time. And heck, just in 2004, he opened up a show for the Red Hot Chili Peppers in London, and he would have been like 70-ish at that time. Good for him. Still according to biography.com, personally speaking, James had been married 4 times over his life and ended up having 6 kiddos. Well, maybe. So he was married to, and I'll get to that in a second. He was married to a lady named Velma Warren from 1953 to 1969, to Deidre Jenkins from 1970 to 1981, to Adrian Rodriguez from 1984 to 1996, and then Tommy Ray Heine from 2002 to 2004. According to his Wikipedia page, he had, and I'm not kidding, this is what his Wikipedia page says, 9, possibly 13 children. So as his Wikipedia page explains, he had 9 children that he, quote, acknowledged. So the 9 that he acknowledged are Teddy, who actually passed away before him in 1973. We have Terry, Larry, Daryl. We have James Jr., and those were all of his sons. And then as well as Lisa, Deanna, Venetia, and Venetia passed away in 2018. And finally, Dr. Yama Brown. So this whole, who were James's kids thing definitely came to be an issue after James passed away. So let's just segue over to that. James passed away on December 25th, 2006 from heart issues that occurred due to pneumonia he was fighting. He was 73 years old at the time of his passing. A little foreshadowing to what I'll go into next, but in total, his estate took around 15 years. Yes, 15 years to settle. So let's get into it. Following his death, a fairly elaborate estate plan was discovered involving a last will and testament and some trust planning. So let's start with the will, which was signed in August of 2000. Because of how he owned his assets, his will covered his more personal assets like personal property like clothing, cars, jewelry, that sort of stuff. That will left things beneficiary-wise to 6 of his children, namely Terry, Larry, Daryl, Dr. Yama Brown, Deanna, and Venetia. All others, regardless if he acknowledged them or not, were left out. Though there was a slight issue with the date of his will. According to his Wikipedia page, it was created a mere 10 months before James Jr. was born, and created a year or so before James married Tommy Ray Heine. So naturally, that caused some issues, including Tommy Ray Heine trying to ask the court to count her as James's official widow. And there sure was some scuttlebutt about that. So like I said, Tommy Ray was his 4th and his last wife. And after he passed away, the validity of their marriage actually got questioned. According to James' Wikipedia page, when James and Tommy Ray got married, she was supposedly still married to a man in Bangladesh, but Tommy Ray argued that she only married that guy so he could obtain residency in the United States. Consequently, Tommy Ray provided her and James's marriage certificate. So the back and forth continued. In January of 2015, a judge ruled that Tommy Ray was officially the widow of James Brown. And the judge made the decision by stating that Tommy Ray's marriage to the Bangladesh guy was invalid. So her marriage to James was valid and maintained until James's passing. Though less than a month later, in February of 2015, the South Carolina Supreme Court basically said, no, stop. And they halted all the lower courts' actions regarding James's estate. But finally, in July of 2018, so yes, like 3 years later, the Court of Appeals ruled that Tommy Ray was confirmed to be James's widow. Would you even believe me if I said things did not stop there? Well, believe me, because in 2020, the South Carolina Supreme Court ultimately held that Tommy Ray had not been legally married to James, and therefore, she did not have a right to his estate. Wow. So even though James's will was created after the marriage to Tommy Ray, that didn't matter because the Supreme Court said that their marriage was invalid. Now on to his kids. As somewhat expected, especially given he appears to have disinherited even some of the kids that he, quote, acknowledged, things got messy with the kiddos too. In January 2007, the 6 kids that were in the will requested for the executors to be removed, which one of the executors was an attorney and longtime confidant of James. and they requested that a special administrator be appointed. It sounds like from the articles I read, and granted, I probably spent way too much time digging to figure out like what executor was in charge and when. But nonetheless, so from the articles I read, according to an article in the Augusta Chronicle, the Augusta Chronicle by Susan McCord, the executor trustees, David Cannon, Buddy Dallas, which was the attorney, confidant, longtime friend guy that I mentioned a second ago, and Alfred Bradley, they were removed, and the court appointed Adele Pope and Robert Buchanan as the new executors and trustees. But then, about a year later, Pope and Buchanan were replaced by Russell Baughnight, a CPA, as the executor and trustee. And Baughnight is who saw the estate until the very end. Yet another issue we saw arise in James's estate following his passing, like how we've seen in other celebrities' estates following their passing, is that there was some serious questions and disputes over the value of James's estate. There have been figures in the single digits, like $5 million-ish. There have even been figures in the double digits and like drastically more, like to the tune of $85 million. And that's a massive difference, right? Well, it sounds like it ended up closer to the $85 million amount, primarily due to Baughnight. Remember, he's the guy in charge, working with a company called Primary Wave, which is a company that, according to a New York Times article by Ben Cesario and Steve Knopner, Primary Wave, quote, specializes in marketing estates and song catalogs, end quote. So Primary Wave is buying much of James's estate, like his music rights, his real estate, some of his real estate, and control of James's name and likeness. And as you can imagine, all of that is worth a lot of money. Honestly, James Brown's estate could go on for 2 Legal Tea episodes. Not only was there all this craziness with Tommy Ray, the widow, but not the widow, the drama with the executors and trustees, drama with the kids, but then there was also the trust that we have not talked about. And that is partially because it's been difficult to hone in on what the trust said and what the trust has done and will be doing. And what I mean by that is ultimately, like over the course of these 15 years, ultimately James's estate and trusts were taking such a long time to administer, primarily due to all this fighting and all that stuff, that things ultimately ended up in a settlement. So they got settled in a private settlement arrangement agreement, and the terms of that agreement are confidential. So what we do know, according to a Smithsonian Magazine article by Livia Gershon, is that there were 2 trusts created. One was created to support his grandchildren, which is said to have been funded with about $2 million. And the other trust received the rest of the funds from the Primary Wave sale, which was supposedly in the neighborhood of $90 million. And that trust was funded for scholarships for children in South Carolina and Georgia, because South Carolina was where James was born and Georgia was where he grew up. And that was something James had expressly put in his estate plan. So how about we end on that note, a relatively good note, even though the general vibe of the James Brown estate was sour. Sour because it took 15 years. It was a 15-year-long battle between, everyone. Though it sounds like it was super important to James to be charitable, hence the scholarship fund. So it's great to see that intent be actually carried out appropriately. Alrighty, let's wrap this episode up. Next week, we are back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real-life clients, real-life cases that I or my office have actually worked on. During that episode, we're going to be talking about a family that was ripe for conflict from the start. And hindsight's always 20/20, right? But my goodness, this person may have really benefited from an unbiased third party as the executor and trustee after she passed. The thing to take away from next week's episode is that whoever you pick as the person in charge after you pass, it does not have to be family. And sometimes it's actually best if it's not a family member. So tune in for that next week, Legal Tea listeners. And until then, take care and be well.